Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Maxim, for inviting me. And it's my first trip to St. Petersburg, and it's been fantastic to tour around the city with Vitaly and Lena have been great tour guides. My son and I, son's a little under the weather. He's not here right now, but we've been having a terrific trip to St. Petersburg, independent of getting to meet all of you. So I've been involved with the Guidar Institute for about 3 years, doing some research with some different economists there, and we've written a couple papers. I wanted to tell you about those papers. They're about Russia, and one is the first paper, which I'll talk to you about now, and I should talk for maybe an hour or half an hour. How long is this session planned for?
Well, I think
2 hours?
roughly one hour, questions 1 hour.
1 hour, okay. I don't want to tire you out, because I want you to come back for the second lecture, which might be actually even more interesting than this one. So this paper is about Russia's fiscal gap, and this is an alternative measure of fiscal sustainability. How many people, please be honest, how many people have ever heard the term fiscal gap? Okay. How many people have ever heard the term deficit and debt? Everybody, okay. So the standard measure of fiscal sustainability is the official debt. So for example, if you look today at Greece's official debt, it's perhaps 170% of GDP. The country seems like it's in terrible fiscal shape, right? There may be a mismeasurement there that's quite significant, because the interest that they're having to pay is I think close to zero. So if you present value the payments, they may just be paying back principal. So if you present value at the prevailing market rate for safe, either safe or even risky debt, the actual payments that they're making, the market value of that debt would potentially be much lower. So they may be carrying on the books a really big number, which scares everybody in thinking about investing in Greece, when actually the relief they receive makes the debt a much smaller share of GDP. I don't know the truth about that, but that's just my conjecture, that Greece actually has a much smaller debt to GDP ratio than is being reported, because the debt's not being marked to market. Now let's talk about Italy. They have a debt to GDP ratio about 120%. And they're viewed as, close to, Spain has a smaller debt to GDP ratio, but somehow Italy and Spain are viewed as perhaps the next to go after, and Portugal, after Greece goes. A lot of people think it's just a matter of time before Greece withdraws from the euro because they can't print their own money to pay off these obligations. They're being constrained to a certain extent, and they'd like to default on their debt. If they default on their debt, they might, the banks own the debt, or some part of the debt, or private parties. So you could have more runs on the Greek banks. You could have the big Greek banks fail. If they can't get euros, if the central bank of Greece can't get euros to pay to rescue the banks could fail. That would force the government to go off the euro and print its own drachmas in order to have a financial system. So that's the scenario in which Greece exits the euro. the next country that might come under stress would be Italy. The observation that Greece has had effectively a run on its financial system could lead to a run on the Italian financial system, could lead to a run on the Spanish financial system and the Portuguese financial system, and then we go to Belgium and France. So there's a small probability event of the entire financial system in Europe melting down, and then that could spread across the country, the world, to the US and other places, because we have a financial system that is predicated on faith-based banking. If everybody thinks if everybody thinks other people are running on the banks, they will run too. And deposit insurance at some level doesn't save the day, because if the government has to print enough money to secure these deposits, then people will expect hyperinflation from that printing, and that will lead to people wanting to get the money out right away in order to buy something like IKEA furniture. In order to, I said IKEA furniture because I know you guys are familiar with IKEA furniture, right? Having just run on your banks to try and buy IKEA furniture in light of the devaluation that Russia experienced. So guarantees of deposit insurance, when you really look through it, are not guarantees of canned soup. The government doesn't have big reserves of cans of soup, something real, to guarantee, to back up its deposit insurance promises. So the financial system is built to fail, and a lot of the concern about Greece and Italy and some other countries goes back to the official debt as a share of GDP. Now, let me tell you a story about how a country could get into fiscal problems where there's no debt whatsoever. Okay? And here's the story. Can I walk around and can you still hear me? Are we kind of we're recorded? Okay, so good. Okay, so let's suppose that you folks are young and you folks are old, and I'm the government, I'm your government, and I come to you young people and say, I want to collect some money, it's taxes, I'm going to tax you and give it to your parents over here. Okay? Well, you love your parents. You may not be that altruistic towards them in the sense that you would voluntarily give them money. They may not really love you in the sense that they're giving you money. And there's a lot of evidence, for the US at least, that there's no operational altruism, that parents and adult kids operate as if they're strangers when it comes to, so if money is taken from kids and given to parents on a systematic basis, the parents don't hand it back to the kids in a bequest or in a gift. They just consume it. And in our country, we've had a policy of taking from young people and giving to old people, taxing young people, giving to old people, and the old people consume more. The young people, what do? Well, in the process of telling young people that they are paying taxes, I also tell you that when you're old, when you're sitting over here, I'm going to come to your kids and steal from them and give to you. So right now we're going to expropriate you, but you'll have an opportunity to expropriate your kids. That's a take-as-you-go policy. It's called pay-as-you-go, but it's really take-as-you-go. And so you're now thinking, well, gee, I had to pay taxes now, but now you've got a transfer payment coming in the future because I promised to make transfer payments, and I may actually promise you far more than principal plus interest. Okay? So your consumption doesn't necessarily go down because on a lifetime basis you're better off in present value. Your consumption goes up. What happens to national saving if consumption goes up? National saving goes down, right? And what happens to domestic investment? Well, leaving aside foreign investment, domestic investment goes down as well. And you have a change in the age consumption profile. In the US, for example, the age consumption profile in 1950 looked like this. Actually, I've got the whiteboard here so I can show you. So in 1960, actually, here's age 0, here's age 100. This is what the profile looked like, relative consumption by age. And so let's say a 70-year-old was consuming a lot less than a 40-year-old. This is age 40. This is age, let's say, 70. And this picture is for 1960, early 60s. What's the picture look like today? Oh, it looks basically like that. This is today. Now, if we were one big happy Barrow family, one big altruistic family, who's got the money wouldn't matter. Who's got the resources? If the government, I take some resources from you and give it to your parents, well, the money's still on the table, it's a family meeting, and who gets to consume doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're all sitting around the table where the pile of money, the family's pile of money, is located. If more of it's located on this side of the table near the parents, shouldn't matter. It's the family money. Everybody should consume based on their relative love of each other. They should agree. And the age consumption profile shouldn't change. This is striking evidence that Robert Barrow's model has no empirical validity in the US, even though it's the core model that is underlying almost all the macroeconomic research today, because almost all the macroeconomic research today is based on the infinite horizon, single agent infinite horizon model that can only be justified if you have altruism, operative intergenerational altruism, which we don't have. But that model has been used because it's convenient. You can analytically deal with it more easily than the life cycle model, and you can simulate it more easily. So this entire real business cycle literature is predicated on a model that has no kind of basic empirical grounding. The model is called, Barrow's model is called Ricardian equivalence. I'm not sure that was a good choice of words, but if you go back to David Ricardo's writings about, David Ricardo had the idea that if you take from kids and you give to parents, the parents could hand it back to the kids through bequests. He wrote that in a couple sentences in one of his books, like in 1822. But then the next sentence, which Barrow never quoted in his famous JP article, is that this is ridiculous. That's where Ricardo said, this idea, which is a possibility, is ridiculous. It doesn't happen. Okay, so you can go back and take a look and you'll see what Ricardo thought of his idea, which then Bob Barrow popularized. Nothing against Bob Barrow, it was a brilliant paper. I love the paper, and he may get the Nobel Prize for it, and maybe it's worth, maybe he should. But it's such a cool paper. We give, even if it has no empirical relevance, even if it's taken the entire macroeconomic profession in the wrong direction for decades, I think we still give prizes for cool, beautiful papers. And there you go. The reality is that this is what's operational, and if I engage in taking from you and giving to you and telling you you're going to get yours when you're older, and I tax you, transfer payment, when you're old, you're sitting over here, tax your kids, transfer payment, and every period I make these taxes larger and the transfer payments larger. What is the end result of that? in addition to driving the economy's consumption up, because the old people have higher propensities to consume than you guys, because they're close to the end of their lives. They have, like, you know, if in a 2-period world, they have 1 period left to go, they consume everything you give them. Right now, you're being told you're going to more than break even, you consume more. What about your kids? Their propensity to consume is 0. So we're taking from, in effect, young savers and giving to old spenders. That's why national saving goes down, and saving finances investment. So if we could, if you look at national saving, this is the basic trajectory with a lot of jumps around from 1950 in the US to today, 2015. The national saving rate went from about 15% to about 3%. And the domestic investment rate went down from about 15% to about 4% today. So this is 4%. So exactly what the life cycle model, the difference is the current account deficit, foreigners investing. And of course, these are not straight lines. There's a lot of movement, but that's the basic trend. And that's exactly what the life cycle model predicts that would happen with a fiscal policy. If you simulate, as I'll show you simulations in the next lecture, the kinds of policies the US has been running in the post-war period, you'll see exactly that coming out of the simulation model. So I keep taking from you and your kids and your grandkids, and every period I raise the amount. Now notice, I'm going to start this economy off with no official debt. Am I running a deficit? What I'm doing is I'm taxing you guys and giving it to you guys. So taxation equals expenditures. This is a balanced budget program, right? Okay. So what do you think happens? You guys earn a certain amount of money, I grab some part of it and give it to your parents. Then you're old, you're sitting over here, I come to your kids, they earn a certain amount of money, I take a bigger share of that in taxes, give it to your parents. Then your kids come along. I take an even bigger share of that and give it to the parents, to you guys. And then the grandkids show up and I take an even bigger share. Where's the end of this process?
You take 100%.
You take one, that's when game is over. That's game over. That's the notion of a policy that's not sustainable. And of course, since the young are really bringing the capital stock into the next period, there's no capital for the next generation. After we take every single penny of a generation's earnings to give it to the old people, then the next generation has no capital to work with, and if the production function is Cobb-Douglas, they don't earn any money at all, and the economy is dead, and everybody in the economy is dead. That's what I would call an unsustainable fiscal policy. Where's the debt? This is a balanced budget policy every period. How do you use the debt to describe this as an unsustainable? Here we have an unsustainable fiscal policy. There's no debt.
You can think about generations after you take 100. So where do you get the money then? You take 100, the next logical step you need to get more than 100, but you don't have that money, isn't it?
Well, suppose there's no other country to borrow from, okay? So or a tax. So the economy is, at that point, the economy has been killed, and the people have been killed. So how is it that this unsustainable fiscal policy has no debt if we're using debt as the basic measure of fiscal policy? What's going on? Could we say that there's a problem with debt not being the right measure of sustainable fiscal policy? I think we can, right, from this example. Could we run the same policy as a debt policy, where we do describe, where we do start reporting a big debt? Well, yeah, I could come to you guys, you're the first generation of young people, rather than taking the money and calling it taxes, I'm going to take the money and call it borrowing and give it to you people and call it a transfer payment. Now we have no taxes and a transfer payment. Now we have a deficit. The next period we have an official debt. I come to your kids, I borrow from them to pay back, to pay what I promised you. So let's say I promise you a high return, a high interest on the debt, on the borrowing. And so every period I'm borrowing more and more. And now the debt gets bigger and bigger as a share of GDP, which gets smaller and smaller. GDP gets smaller and smaller. Now we have a debt on the books. Now what have I done? What's different? Physically, nothing's different, right? Anything different? Physically, is there anything different? So have I just engaged in magic? The first case, we ran this policy with no debt. The second case, we ran this with an exploding amount of debt. What have I done differently? When I came to you the first time, I took the money, and what did I call it? And when I came to you the second time, I took the money, the same amount of money, what did I call it? I called it borrowing, right? What did I do?
You made an official promise.
I changed words. I changed words, right? If I came to you and talked about this today in Russian, if I could speak Russian, I should speak Russian. Grandfather was born in Kiev. I have a Russian last name, back 1890, but I unfortunately don't speak Russian. But if I spoke to you about any economic model in Russian, and then I switched and spoke to you about the same model in German or French or English, would that change the model? The math would be the same, right? If we come to math, we can just use any language we want to discuss it. So fiscal language is also a language. So the choice of fiscal language is arbitrary. There's nothing that in economics, in economic theory, that pins down the choice of fiscal language. It's completely arbitrary. There's no grounding to it, which means that the deficit and the debt are not well-defined economic concepts. In just the same way as in physics, the distance of this table, as well as the time right at this moment, is not a well-defined concept, because if you're heading through space in this direction at this speed, you'll measure time right now as as a certain number. But if you're heading that way at a different speed, it'll be measured as a different number. So that frame of reference is like a language. So if you use that language, you've got one measure. If you use this language, you have another measure. So time can be that number or this number, but there's lots of different directions. So you can actually have an infinite number of different measures of time right at this second. And you can have an infinite number of different measures of distance. Well, you can have an infinite number of different measures of a debt for the same underlying fiscal policy just by the choice of words. Now, everybody see that point? Okay. So, and if you want to, there's a paper, if you want to be convinced that this is true for any neoclassical model, there's a paper on my website, which is probably the most important paper I ever wrote. Not that I've written for what better, whatever you want to think about what I've written. But if you go to kotlikoff.net and you click on articles and you go to just search for Green, Jerry Green. This is a paper called On the General Relativity of Fiscal Language, which was published in a book, and
It's available on your site.
It's available, and there are equations, and we show that in any general framework, this is a contingent claims market, there can be incomplete markets, incomplete information. As long as the agents are rational, the debt, the deficit, taxes, transfer payments, disposable income, personal saving, private saving, government wealth, none of these terms, none of these measures which we use routinely in economics and occupy large sections of undergraduate textbooks, macro textbooks. Everybody learns about national accounting, and there's a big section about all these terms. None of these is well defined. These are meaningless measures. Really meaningless? What if the government chooses the words? What if the government says that it's borrowing and a transfer payment? How could it be meaningless if the government uses the words, chooses the words? Well, think about it. Are you a member of the government?
No.
Okay. So I'm a member of the government, and I say it's borrowing. It's borrowing, it's borrowing, it's borrowing. What do you say? You're just as adamant. What do you say? It's taxes, it's taxes, it's taxes. You say it's not borrowing, 100% borrowing or 100% taxes. You say it's 80% borrowing and 20% taxes. You say it's 81% borrowing and 19% taxes. You get the point? Just because the government says it uses its set of words doesn't mean that we're not free to use other sets of words. What this theory says is that any set of words is equally, any internally consistent labeling convention is equally valid, but none of these things will tell you anything you need to know about the sustainability of fiscal policy. None of these, because I can produce any deficit, any debt numbers I want. So if we're focused on debt, I can make the debt zero, I can actually make it negative. I can choose words so that the debt here is negative. So as I'm driving the economy down into the ground, I can announce a growing surplus. How do I do that? Well, I take money from you. I take more taxes than I would otherwise. Let's say I'm taking 1,000 rubles from each of you, okay, to give to them. What I can say is that I'm taxing you 2,000 rubles and making a loan back to you of 1,000. Now I'm running a surplus. I take the net 1,000 and give to you. You can produce, for any underlying fiscal policy, you can produce any path whatsoever, rising, falling, moving up and down every year, of the debt just by the choice of words. The debt is not a well-defined concept, just like time and distance aren't well-defined in physics. We cannot use these words coherently as economists. It's not scientific. We have to stop using measures that have no meaning. Okay? So
but there is a letter D.
What?
There is a letter D in our models, and we manipulate it.
But we can take those same models and use different letters.
Yes, yes, yes. But I mean that in models that is defined more or less.
No, it's not. This paper shows it's not defined because I can take those same equations and use different letters. I can take the same equations and say rather than borrowing, rather than calling that money B for borrowing, I'll call it T for taxes. Okay? And all the incentives will be the same. Nothing, whether or not we have liquidity constraints or you name it, incomplete markets, adverse selection, any kinds of market problems, as long as agents are rational, we have this labeling problem. And
equations are rational and if they are homogeneous, but if they are heterogeneous.
No. They can be totally heterogeneous. I can say that I'm borrowing from you and taxing you. Okay? Heterogeneity has nothing to do with it. Rationality here, the importance of rationality is that people don't get fooled by language. Okay? They don't get fooled by, they just look at their lifetime budgets. They just look at their true marginal incentives. They look at prices, marginal prices, and they look at their budget constraints. And their budget constraints, with any choice of language, the budget constraints are the same, the lifetime budget constraints are the same, and also the marginal prices are the same. So that's all it takes, people not to get fooled by language and just focus on the fundamentals. So now the question is, how do you measure fiscal sustainability if you can't use the debt because the debt is a meaningless number? So I need you to all promise, when you're talking to your students, never to use the word deficit, debt, taxes, transfer payments, disposable income, personal saving, private saving, ever again. Because whenever you use those words, just realize you're not doing science. You're doing black magic of some sort. It's no longer economics that you're doing. I'm sorry to deliver this bad news, but the profession has been going down a ridiculous path, as I'm going to explain to you in a second in terms of when we look at the right kinds of calculations of fiscal sustainability. Now, how do you measure fiscal sustainability? Well, the government is making promises of expenditures, including servicing what it calls official debt, and it has promises of receipts to cover those expenditures. And under any set of labels, it has to be the case that the present value of the expenditures is covered by the present value of the receipts. That's what's called the government's intertemporal budget constraint. Every dynamic macroeconomic model has an intertemporal budget constraint of the government. You guys have all heard about that, right? So the only real question here is, are we running a policy such that if we keep it constant, if we maintain that policy through time, the government will satisfy its intertemporal budget constraint? That's the key question. And in the case of this unsustainable policy, if I promise to every generation from now to the end of time that I'm going to be taking from them and paying them off when they're old, more than they put in, well, if I present value those promises and compare it with the receipts, the government's intertemporal budget constraint won't be satisfied, because when we come to the generation from whom we've taken everything to give to the old, and I've promised them when they're old resources from the next generation won't have it to pay them. So that's a promise which can't be kept. It's a case where there's a gap between the present value of the promises and the present value of the receipts. That's where the government's intertemporal budget constraint is not satisfied. So this is called fiscal gap accounting, because we're looking at the gap between the present value of the spending and the present value of the receipts. And fiscal gap, and it's over the infinite horizon. It's not over 10 years or 5 years or 30 years or 75 years or 50 years. It's only well-defined over the infinite horizon. And by well-defined, I mean you're going to get the same fiscal gap no matter what choice of words you use, but only if you measure the fiscal gap over the infinite horizon. So you have to project out to infinity and discount back. These are present values. And we know that if the that the present value of something way in the future is very small and gets smaller and smaller the further out. So don't worry too much about infinity. But we have to, but that's an important thing. Now, have we persuaded anybody in the US government to do fiscal gap accounting? Well, actually, back in 2002, which is 13 years ago, a co-author of mine, Kent Smetters, persuaded the Secretary of Treasury to do fiscal gap accounting for the Social Security system. So this is saying, let's forget all the rest of the government, which is not really appropriate, and just look at the Social Security, our pension system, and take the present value of all the spending, and look at the present value of all the tax, the receipts, including the trust fund, because that's like a trust fund is really the present value of income from the trust fund, if you like, or withdrawals from the trust fund. So that's like a receipt. So they do fiscal gap accounting. He persuaded them to do that, and they've been coming out with a fiscal gap measure for the Social Security system, an infinite horizon fiscal gap measure for 13 years. And that fiscal gap gets bigger and bigger. It's currently $25 trillion. So the official debt in our country in the hands of the public, the debt that the Fed has not printed money to buy back, the official debt in the hands of the public is 13 trillion. So the Social Security debt, if you like, is 25 trillion. It's not on the books because when the government takes money from young people to give old people their old age pensions, they call it taxes and transfer payments. I can go back and call that borrowing and transfer payments, and then borrowing and return of principal plus interest when you were here. And if I did that, the 25 trillion would be on the books. So fiscal gap accounting is really putting everything on the books, all the commitments. And it's not just for transfer payments, but also defense spending and other government discretionary spending, paying to renovate this building if the government does it. Although this building is beautiful, it doesn't need to be renovated, but Maxim told me some other parts were going to be upgraded. That's part of government spending. Paying for, we have a president, he has lunch every day. President paying for his lunch is a discretionary expenditure. Filling up Air Force One, that's our presidential jet, that's with gasoline. That's jet fuel, that's discretionary spending. Now, how big is, first of all, how many people think we should replace the debt accounting with the fiscal gap accounting, given everything I've said so far? Are you guys, how many people are unsure? Let me start there. Okay. How many people say no? Let's stick with the conventional measures. Nobody says that. How many people think we should go with what I'm suggesting, fiscal gap accounting?
We should read the paper.
Okay. So I'm going to put you all in the category of unsure, okay? Now I'm going to show you some people that are sure. And this may give you a little more confidence in this idea. So there's a bill in front of Congress. It's a bipartisan bill called the Inform Act. It's a bill that I wrote most of the language of it, but it requires the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget and the General Accountability Office, the three major agencies that deal with fiscal issues in the US, to do fiscal gap accounting out through the infinite horizon on an ongoing basis. And then we wrote the bill, and then I went and asked some people to endorse it. I set up this website to permit economists and other people to endorse the bill. Let's see how many people have endorsed the bill, starting with Nobel Prize winners in economics. Well, we've got Ken Arrow. How many people, you know, a lot of people have probably heard his name. He's probably the top economist in the world alive today, maybe the second top economist of all time, after Paul Samuelson. Bob Engel, Gene Fama. Gene Fama is in finance, right? This is a financial question. He endorsed the bill. Lars Hansen just got the Nobel Prize. James Heckman, Finn Kindlin, Bob Lucas, Eric Maskin, he's a theorist. He can't be way off. Markowitz, another Nobel Prize winner in finance. Meyerson, game theorist. Phelps, Sargent, Schelling, Sharp, another Nobel Prize winner in finance. Vernon Smith, Ollie Williamson. Now there's a couple others. Chris Sims says he's going to endorse this at some point when he feels okay about the macro. I don't know why he's waiting, but he said he's going to endorse it. And Bob Merton, who I've talked to, he's a friend of mine, another Nobel Prize winner in finance. He privately says this is the way to go. It's obvious. I mean, because you don't want to have a measure that's language-based. So they should be get you to raise your hands at some point, maybe not right now. Let me show you some former government officials here who endorsed this bill. These are the senators and members of Congress that have endorsed it, who introduced the bill. But then we have George Shultz. He's the former Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, he was the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and was the Secretary of Commerce. Labor. He's probably had more cabinet positions than anybody ever. He's about 93. Took about 2 seconds for him to endorse this bill. Michael Boskin, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. David Stockman, former director of OMB. Sheila Bair, former chief of the FDIC. And then the list goes on. Less prominent people, but they're pretty prominent. Now let's go to US-based economists. Well, we've got Steve Ross. He's probably the next guy to get the Nobel Prize in economics for finance. So we're talking about every single person, I haven't gotten to Myron Scholes yet, in finance, every major person in finance except for Myron, who I'm sure would endorse this if I ever get contact with him. Endorsing this, Jeff Sachs. Jeff's pretty much on the left. Fiscally, he's pretty conservative. You know, Jeff was here and helped rush with his privatization. Whether or not you think that was a good move, the way he did it, or tried to help, is another question, but he's a very prominent economist. And then we have people, just to show you, he's on the left. We have people on the right. For example, Michael Boskin was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the first President Bush. Stockman worked for Reagan. Glenn Hubbard is in this list. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the second President Bush. He's very much to the right. So you got people on the left and the right, the center, endorsing this bill. And now look at the other US economists. You've got people from MIT, Berkeley, UCLA, Boston University, of course, and the list goes on. Yale, every top department, Maskin's at Harvard, so Minnesota, Duke, the list goes on. So every top department, there's somebody endorsing this bill. We've got over 1,200 economists have endorsed this bill. That's the economics profession saying with one voice. There's a couple people that haven't that are prominent, like Paul Krugman and Art Laffer, people who believe in economic magic, black magic or white magic, whatever you want to call it. They have not yet endorsed this bill. Apparently economic theory doesn't matter to them anymore, at least to Krugman anymore. He used to be a theorist. I don't think it ever mattered to Art Laffer. But Apart from that, this is the entire economics profession telling our country, our government, that we have to do this accounting and stop doing the other accounting. And also, they know how big the problem is. They know what that we have in the US a $210 trillion fiscal gap. And they know that that represents an economic time bomb under the legs of our children. A fiscal time bomb. And that's why they came on board. It would be enough just to have Ken Arrow endorse this bill, from my perspective. Just Ken Arrow by himself would be enough. That's equivalent to me of Albert Einstein writing to President Roosevelt in 1938 that the Germans are about to invent the bomb and we need to take this seriously. This is what the economics profession in the US has done as a group. It's very noteworthy. So 210 trillion is a very big fiscal gap. It's much bigger than the Social Security fiscal gap of 25 trillion, because Social Security has a dedicated payroll tax which is being netted against the expenditure promises, and that's about 12.4% of payroll, up to a ceiling. So Social Security's, if you want to, and this is a labeling game, if you want to call those payroll taxes part of Social Security and you don't have to, then you could say that the fiscal gap in Social Security is only 25 trillion, only 25 trillion. If you include Social Security and everything else, all the other expenditures and all the other taxes and other receipts, and again, you can use whatever labeling convention you want, you'll get the same answer. You have a fiscal gap of 210 trillion. And where do I come up with these projections? Well, the Congressional Budget Office puts out something called the Alternative Fiscal Scenario every year. It's their projection. They project out 75 years. It's very easy to extend their projection beyond 75 years, and that's what I did. So I looked at their report that was on their website of the Alternative Fiscal Scenario back in July of last year. I extended it, used Excel, it took me about 5 minutes. Came up with a fiscal gap of 210 trillion. They are afraid to report this because they are politically motivated. The Congressional Budget Office is a political operation. It's not an honest reporter of fiscal policy. The Democrats and the Republicans in our country, the politicians, do not want the truth revealed about the state of our fiscal affairs. We did a fiscal gap and generational accounting analysis under the Clinton administration in 1994. I and Alan Auerbach and a former grad student of mine, Jagdish Gokhale. 2 days before, and we worked with the Office of Management and Budget, we prepared this document. It was going to be at the bottom of the president's budget in the appendix, buried in the appendix of a document that's this thick. There's volume, appendix. A couple pages under, 5 pages in here. It got censored 2 days before it was supposed to be printed. They pulled that out. And who did that? Well, his name is Gene Sperling. He was the former chief economist for President Obama. So he moved from lying under Clinton to lying under Obama over time. Under George Bush II, or the junior, I would say, the lesser, probably some other useful adjective here. I say this because he was the most fiscally profligate president probably in the history of the country, because the fiscal gap went up dramatically under him. But anyway, Secretary O'Neill, who was a Treasury Secretary, the first Treasury Secretary, and a very honest guy and would speak his mind. And he was the person who put that fiscal gap accounting for Social Security into the Social Security trustees report. And it stayed there somehow. It hasn't been censored, although they keep moving it further and further back into the appendix of that report. And the trustees, who are political appointees, never seem to read that because they make no mention of it in their description of the problems of the system. Okay, so anyway, Secretary O'Neill commissioned a fiscal gap study for the United States in 2002. And I know this because two co-authors of mine were heading up the project. And every day I would call them and I would ask them, has it been censored yet? And they would say, no, not yet. And then on December 7th, 2002, a day that will live in infamy. Why did I say a day that will live in infamy? That's what President Roosevelt said when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And December 7th is Pearl Harbor Day. So on December 7th, 2002, Secretary O'Neill was fired. He wasn't asked to resign. He wasn't given the opportunity to resign. We had Vice President Cheney, a marvelous American. That's satirical, if you didn't get that. He decides that he should just fire this guy, who is a great American, and he just announces to the press he's fired, just like that. And out the door, O'Neill goes. 2 days later, this study that was supposed to show up in the president's budget in February of 2003 is censored. They fired Secretary O'Neill, I believe, because he was trying to put an honest statement out about the fiscal condition, while the Bush administration was trying to make sure that they would get Florida next time in the next election. Remember, Florida was a very close call in the first election where they had to recount the votes, and there was the Supreme Court had to decide whether Al Gore or, yeah, thanks, he's easy to forget, Al Gore or G.W. Bush would be elected. And they went with Bush. But Florida was a very tight call. So what do you do to get more votes from Florida the next time around? You give them free benefits. You take more from the young and give them to the old. And in this case, it was Medicare drug prescription benefits. So older people started having most of their prescription drug benefits being paid for by the government. Overnight, the fiscal gap went up $15 trillion. And this was going to be voted on by Congress in early 2003. So President Bush and his buddies did not want to have a federal budget document that said the country had an enormous fiscal gap. So he fired Paul O'Neill and he censored the study. So whenever anybody says there's a conspiracy, you have to think that maybe they're crazy, right? But I lived through this. These are facts, okay? You can get Secretary O'Neill here, and he will say exactly what I said. You can get Alan Auerbach, who was with me back in 2000. They will, Gene Sperling, if he told the truth, if he learned how to do that, he would be able to confess that he did this. So we have both political parties wanting to hide the facts. They want to use language. The choice of words here is not innocent. They're used to keep things off the books and to hide the facts of the fiscal condition of the country. Now, $210 trillion fiscal gap in the US represents 10.5% of the present value of GDP. So what this means is that we are short 10.5% of GDP forever. We need to have 10.5% more of GDP collected in taxes to cover the spending every year for the end of time. That's 58% of the present value of taxes. Another way of saying this is we have to today and forever have a path of revenues that's 58% higher. Another option is to cut spending today and forever by 33%. So we have to go to my mom, who's 90, almost 96, and she gets a monthly Social Security check and say, sorry, Mom, a third of your check is going bye-bye. We have to tell her that a third of her old age health care benefits is going bye-bye. American older people are not used to this. They would come at you with their canes and walkers if you said this to them, if you tried to do this. So we have a huge problem in our country coming to getting this fiscal gap down to zero. Now I have a set of proposals called the Purple Plans. If you go to the purpleplans.org, many economists have endorsed them for fixing health care, for fixing Social Security, for fixing taxes, fixing the banking system, fixing that I believe would get the fiscal gap down to zero and cause the least amount of pain. But that's radical reform. That's what we need. Let's now talk about Russia. This was a long introduction to get back to Russia in this study, okay? This study was with a lot of economists at GAIDAR, and we took about a year to produce it. Okay, let's see. Russia's fiscal gap, there we go. And it has all these Russian economists, some of whom did more than others, but I don't want to start any battles inside the GAIDAR institution, so we just listed everybody. This is the NBR paper, the longest number of co-authors ever, okay, actually. But we worked a long time. There's lots and lots of details in the paper for how we figured out the projections. We used, wherever possible, your government's own forecasts. We used the Rostat projections of demographics. We compared those with the UN. We thought Rostat was actually more accurate than the UN. We used the Ministry of Economics, their projections of GDP. They only go out to 2030. So wherever we could, we used the official numbers. We got essentially no cooperation from the agencies. That's life here in Russia, but we took their published studies and we used them. And we then used reasonable projections out into the future. We took your reserves. We thought about the amount of energy. You're getting about 40% or 40% of your budget is being paid for from the energy sector. We took that and we, taking the proven reserves, we figured out when they would all be used up and when full depletion would occur. That's out about 75 years. And we found a fiscal gap in Russia. Do you think it's bigger or smaller than the US? What?
In absolute values?
No, as a share of GDP. So I said it's 10.5% of GDP. What do you think it is for Russia? What's your best guess? In this study, it includes the pension system, the healthcare system.
2 times higher.
What? 7%. 7%, 2 times higher. So you're at 20%, 21%. Anybody else? 50%. 50? In this study, it came out to be 8.5%. Actually, better. 8.5%. But don't get too optimistic, don't get too excited yet, because that was last year's study. And one of the economists here, Eugene Goryunov, has updated the study. We received pension projections from some people who had a model of the pension system. When we looked more closely at the model over the past year, we decided their projections were not really that good. And so we have other Eugene came up with projections that are more realistic. In particular, pensions expenditures as a share of GDP rise over time as the country gets older. Russia's getting older, and the total population is projected to fall. And in the next lecture, I'll show you exactly by how much, but it's a lot. And so the country is getting older, and we were originally not getting, because we went with their model, a group within GIDAR that had a pension model, but we didn't know the guts of it until later, so we now mistrust the model. We came up with our own estimates, and we also came up with our own estimate of healthcare spending as a share of GDP, which we also have now rising as the country ages, because people that are older are more expensive, or unhealthy, or less healthy, and unhealthier is not a word, but they're less healthy, and therefore they cost more. So when we do this, Eugene tells me, he did a presentation at the GIDAR forum last Friday, not the forum, but at the GIDAR Institute, just as a workshop. He's saying that the fiscal gap now is about 13% of the present value of GDP. So we're at 10.5. It might be higher, probably might be 11 now, because the study I did was close to a year old. And Russia's at 13% of GDP. That's not good. What is Italy's fiscal gap as a share of the present value of its GDP? Italy has one of the highest present value, has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios. If you look at debt to GDP, which I told you not to, Italy looks really bad. What do you think the size of its fiscal gap is? You think maybe it's worse than Russia's, maybe it's worse than the US, maybe it's 20%. Or maybe it's smaller. Or maybe it's negative. It's actually negative.
Negative? What does it mean?
It means that they have projected receipts that exceed the present value of the projected spending. Now why? Well, because Italy has engaged in 2 massive pension reforms. They've really cut, for younger generations, the pensions dramatically, like 40%. And their healthcare system is under control. Our healthcare system expenditures have a history of exploding, because per capita benefits under our 2 old age systems, Medicare and Medicaid, grow at a rate that's 2 percentage points higher than per capita GDP grows. It's absolutely crazy, but that's what we've allowed to happen, and that's projected by the CBO to continue for a while. So Italy is actually in far better fiscal shape than Russia or Greece or the US. It's actually in the best fiscal shape of any country in the European Union, in the EU.
And do they know this?
Do they know this? Well, the Minister of Economy knows this, because I was meeting with him in December telling him this. But this study was done not by me, but by the European Commission. If you look for the S2 indicator, there's a book, and of course they always bury these numbers in the back of the book, but if you look, they have an infinite horizon fiscal gap calculation for all the European Union members, except for Greece for some reason. They couldn't get the Greek data. And they're reporting a negative 2% for Italy. For Luxembourg, it's 12%. Luxembourg is in the worst shape of any of the EU countries. You know, you go to Luxembourg, it looks pretty rich, but they're running some pretty wild and crazy fiscal policy. They're in big, big, big trouble. They don't seem to get it. Germany's about 2% positive, 2-3% positive. France is around there. England's about 5% positive. So that's the kind of range we're talking about. Basically, the EU is in much better shape than the US. And the US seems to be in somewhat better shape than Russia at this point. Yes?
Out of curiosity, did you do these calculations for Japan or somebody else?
Japan appears to be, yeah, Japan appears to be, on a fiscal gap basis, maybe 8-9%. I didn't do it, but some Japanese economists have told me what we need to do is have the OECD do this for every major country in the world on a systematic basis if they would do their job. They were going to do that until somebody came along and said no. Who was that somebody? It was somebody who hired Gene Sperling. That somebody was Larry Summers. When he was Secretary of Treasury, he vetoed a project by the OECD to do this analysis on an ongoing basis. Did he really? Yeah, he did, because he has become a political economist, not an economist, a political economist. And to be honest, and that's his legacy for future generations, to leave them not knowing what we're, and leaving current Americans and current older people in all the major countries not understanding what they're doing to their children. I think we have been waging a war on our children. In the US, it's a fiscal war, it's a climate change, well, it's not just the US, it's around the world, there's a climate change war. In our country, there's an educational war in the sense we deprive young people of decent education. And those are three major battles of attack, or battles that we're having with our children. Maybe I'm missing something. But I think it's education, environment, and fiscal policy. And I think it's time for our country, our government, our Congress to formally declare war on our children, because that's what we're engaged in. So we should understand who our enemy is and declare war on our children and make that perfectly clear. And then maybe we go even further, hurt them even more. Or maybe we wake up and understand the immorality of what we're doing. But we're not going to understand the immorality of what we're doing until we really focus on the truth. And as economists, we have an obligation to the truth. That's the only thing we have. We only have our science. We only have our math. And if we can't stick to our math, we're nowhere. So that's what we need to do, and that's today's initial lecture. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, I'm not sure what time it is, but
may I ask a very simple question? The problem is that 5 or 7 years ago, I tried to understand this generational accounting, but I couldn't do this. So what is the paper to read and to understand?
Well, I do have on my website some papers about generational accounting. Generational accounting is the following. You take the fiscal gap, and then you ask the question, what if you just leave that for people who are young and who are now children, and also those who are coming in the future, and you proportionally raise their lifetime net taxes. So let's just assume, for example, that we leave everybody who's we just leave this burden for people that are who are going to be born starting tomorrow, okay? Well, we can figure out by what percentage we have to raise their lifetime taxes in order to get the fiscal gap to be zero. So if we currently living people leave the entire burden to future generations, the unborn, how big will the burden be? That's generational accounting. So you start with the fiscal gap and then you allocate it, and there's different ways to allocate it. But that's the question it's answering. And of course you have to project under current policy, where the gap is not closed, the size of the lifetime net tax rates that each new generation will pay. And then you take this fiscal gap and you uniformly raise all those tax rates by the same percentage in order to close the fiscal gap. And if we have to raise taxes immediately and permanently by 58% on everybody that's alive, including me right now, you can imagine how much higher we have to raise taxes if we leave everybody who's now alive out of the picture, and we leave the entire $210 trillion fiscal gap to be covered by people that aren't yet born. You can think about how big those taxes would have to be, and they get to the point where we have to extract every single penny of their earnings from them. We get to game over. So a $210 trillion fiscal gap in the context of current generations ducking their obligations is a prescription for insolvency, for the country actually going into ruin. And unlike Russia, well, I won't say this, the US has politics such that the elderly have a lot of power. politically. Why do the elderly have power? Because when it comes to election day, they're the ones who aren't working. They have the time to vote, and therefore they have a disproportionate amount of power. They're also very well organized. The American Association of Retired People is the largest lobbying group in the country. They have 50 million people. Everybody over 50 is immediately asked to enroll in this group. And so when it comes to making any fiscal changes that are going to affect the elderly adversely, they're right there lobbying with a lot of money and a lot of votes Congress not to do anything that's appropriate when it comes to, and they've been doing this for decades. That's why it's called in the US, when we talk about reforming Social Security, people say that Social Security is the third rail of politics. The third rail in a railroad track is electrified. So the idea is that if Congress touches Social Security, they're touching the third rail, and any congressman or woman will be instantly politically dead. And that's a well-known phrase. If you Google third rail American politics, you will see a lot of things come up that say exactly that. So that's generational accounting. Other questions?
Can I ask a simple and stupid question? As far as
no questions are stupid.
As far as I understood, you propose to increase taxes in Russia and in USA to decrease this fiscal gap. But I'm curious, in order to say this, we have to know the point on the Laffer curve.
Yes, absolutely very important. For Russia and for the US, the marginal taxes are very high. So if you're going to try and get more revenue out of either country, you need to be very careful about how you do it.
Yeah,
so you don't.
You have to decrease taxes.
You may have to, yes. You have a payroll tax, it's about 34%. So I have not advocated that Russia raise all taxes by, in your country, you need about a 28% immediate and permanent hike in your taxes because you've got different tax bases. Let me just show you, let me just go to the end here. There's some tables here that you can just flip to, and if you immediately adjust in Russia, you need a 29% increase in the whole path of revenues. If you wait for 10 years, it becomes about 31% increase. The longer you wait, the higher the increase. If you wait for, let's say, 30 years, it becomes a 38% immediate and permanent tax hike. So the longer you wait, this is a zero-sum game, generationally speaking, the bigger the burden. So if you wait for 30 years, everybody who's going to be dead between now and 30 years gets to spend, doesn't have to pay more on net, and they're happy. Everybody else is in worse shape. Zero-sum game, generationally speaking. Or you cut expenditures by about a fifth, 22%, or you wait, it becomes 28%. So I'm not advocating increasing all taxes in Russia by 22%. If I were right now, what I would say is there's got to be a better way to fix the fiscal system than that. And here's an example. What if we lowered the payroll tax and reformed the pension system at the same time? The payroll tax is 34%. So almost everybody in Russia, when you add all the taxes together, is in about a 50% marginal tax bracket. This is why you have a pretty big underground economy, an informal sector. So you need to give the informal sector an incentive to come into the formal sector. What I propose for the US and also for Russia is that you take your pension system, you freeze it in place, you pay off through time what you owe, but you don't let people accumulate more benefits under the old system. So you, for example, since you're very young, what's your name?
Michael.
Michael, you would get very little in the way of government pensions, but we'd also the government would take a like 8% of your salary and put it into an account that's invested globally at zero cost in an index fund, and it would be trusteed by, let's say, any international organization that Russians feel comfortable with. And I'm not sure which that might be, but maybe it would be the IMF or the IFC, International Finance Corporation, which is a branch of the World Bank, but it's got a different name, so maybe people would not be too upset if it was called the IFC. So you would have an account with the IFC, you'd be forced to save, and you would be able to observe how your money grows, and you'd be able to get it out of an ATM machine anywhere in the world at any time. It would actually be trusteed. It would be under full control of the IFC. The Russian government could never take it away from you. That's a proposal that involves, over time, lower government expenditures on the existing pension system so that over time those expenditures actually go to zero. And about 22% of the percentage points of the 34% payroll tax is for pensions. That's a really high tax rate because you have so many people in the informal sector. I want to give people in the informal sector a reason to get into the formal sector. And this would be a reason, because you would be able to invest very safely in a diversified manner at no cost globally. And that's something you wouldn't be able to do if you stay in the informal sector. So that's, I think, one way to lower tax rates, give people more incentive to work, and also get into the formal sector and generate more revenue. So I also think you should get rid of your corporate income tax, which may sound very strange, but imagine that you had no corporate income tax. You were the lowest corporate income tax country in the world, in the modern world. There'd be huge incentives to come into Russia to operate. And imagine that you said that any corporate dispute will be adjudicated by the British legal system. They do this in Dubai, okay? They use the British legal system. They use judges. Either judges come from England to Great Britain to Dubai, or they actually have trials over the internet, or people from Dubai go to the UK. Now you have a whole different climate here for investing, because the rule of law is the British rule of law, not the Russian rule of law. And I don't want to be criticizing your rule of law, but if you listen to President or Prime Minister Medvedev, he's publicly talked about corruption and the rule of law, and I'm sure President Putin has as well. So this is not something new to the country, and I'm not saying, those would be two moves that overnight would change the investment climate. Now, there's other things that Russia has to do to get the investment climate to change around, and those are geopolitical things. Obviously, we have a lot of tension over eastern Ukraine. That has ways of being resolved. I personally think that we should come up with a solution for Ukraine and a path for Russia to join NATO as a package deal, so that we lower the temperature. Because the idea of having Russian jets flying very close to NATO jets, and that can lead to an accident. And accidents we saw in World War I how an accident led to devastation, and that led to World War II. You guys just celebrated the victory over Nazi Germany, the 70th year anniversary. We cannot let accidents happen in this world. We have too many crazy people who will take advantage of accidents and go nuts. And there's too many nuclear weapons available for each side to use. So we have to be very, very careful to lower the temperature. But both sides have to win. There are win-win solutions to Ukraine and to the NATO issue and to Crimea. There are. And we just need to find those so that Russia becomes a completely different environment for foreign investment. That will expand your economy and expand your tax base and get your fiscal gap down. Okay? Yeah.
Another question, please. I don't know if, well, obviously the fiscal gap accounting linked pretty much, as you said, to present value, so it's linked to the discount rate. And then if you look at, there was this publication by Norwegian School of Economics about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, about discount rates or perceived discount rates in different countries. And so Russia has the one of the heaviest discount rates, so we just don't care about the future, we care only about today. And the similar scale was shown in Italy, actually, out of all the countries. So Italy and some countries in Latin America, they're probably worse than Russia. So and from that point of view, it's kind of surprising to see. I mean, but you said like Italy underwent some reforms on the pension front. Would it affect, or does it affect anyhow the fiscal gap accounting from that point of view that if you have a heavy discount rate, you don't care about the future. So all you essentially is caring about is what's going on now. And if now everything is okay, then why should you be bothered about it?
Well, if you have a discount rate that makes you kind of not think about the future, makes you want to consume a whole lot today because you think that maybe the future won't be there, then you should be consuming at a very high rate, and the country saves at a low rate, and then it invests at a low rate, and all that makes things worse. So, and it's true that the Italian saving rate has come down. It used to be much higher than it is, the French saving rate. In all the different countries that have been playing take as you go, you see saving rates go downhill. I have a paper with some Australian, some economists who are now in Austria about the declining saving rates in the American Economic Review. In Russia, I think we'd have to, people may say in a survey that they don't really believe in the future, but that may also be an expression that the future is very uncertain, and that may lead them actually to save more. They may have a time preference. They may care not too much less about consuming in the future, but if the future is very uncertain, then they're going to have a very big incentive to save for it, because they don't want to be starving in the future. Even if they don't care that much, they don't want to be starving. So you get these, my guess is that Russians are feeling a lot of uncertainty about the future, and that a lot of Russians are actually saving quite a bit in ways that are tricky, because your banks can fail just like they did in '98, right? They could fail again. That's why I think it's very important to have a zero-cost, simple method to invest, guaranteed, safe method to invest in a diversified global portfolio of stocks and bonds and real estate, all run by one laptop. And it would be an American laptop built in China. This one. This laptop could manage the investment of the entire Russian public. And this proposal, which I call the Purple Social Security Plan, is what I propose for the US and other countries. So what I'm proposing for Russia is no different from what I'm proposing for the US. I propose that the US cut our corporate tax rate to zero, because we have too little investment coming into the country right now. We still have, we just aren't investing. We're investing in 4% versus 15%. The net domestic investment rate's down here. It used to be up there. That's not going to work for us in the long term. And when investment is that low for that long, what happens is that wages don't grow. And wages in our country have basically not been growing for decades. So you have to put, economics puts 2 and 2 together and shows you 4, and then you look at the data and you see 4. You say there's something to it.